The realization dawned on Corporal Wilhelm Sauer not during the thunderous battles of El Alamein, nor in the chaotic retreat across North Africa, but in the quiet cotton fields of Texas. As his calloused hands worked the white bowls under the merciless summer sun, the truth became undeniable. Germany had never stood a chance against America. The abundance surrounding him, the endless fields, the mechanized farm equipment, the sheer scale of production, revealed what propaganda had hidden. It was like a veil lifting, he would later recall. I understood then what we were truly fighting against, not just an army, but an industrial giant that could replace in days what we couldn't produce in months. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The journey that brought Wilhelm Sauer from Rommel's elite Afrika Korps to the cotton fields of Texas began in the winter of 1941. The world was still adjusting to the reality of another global conflict, with Germany's lightning advances having redrawn the map of Europe. Yet far from the freezing Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht was locked in a death struggle with the Soviet Union, another theater had opened in the sun-scorched deserts of North Africa. Here, under the command of the brilliant General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the newly formed Afrika Korps would challenge British dominance of the Mediterranean and threaten the vital Suez Canal. For 22-year-old Wilhelm Sauer, a baker's son from Dresden with a technical aptitude and steady hands, the Afrika Korps represented a chance to serve in what was widely considered an elite force. Unlike the grim predictions surrounding the Russian campaign, North Africa offered what seemed a more conventional and potentially winnable theater. The Desert War had its own mystique, a gentleman's war, some called it, where chivalry and professional respect between adversaries still existed. Sauer, having completed his training as a radio operator, received his orders to join the 15th Panzer Division in November 1941. He would later describe his emotions as a mixture of pride and trepidation. Germany was ascendant, the propaganda assured everyone. Victory seemed inevitable. The Mediterranean crossing was Sauer's first time at sea, and it left an impression that stayed with him for decades. The water was so blue it hurt your eyes, he recalled in a 1978 interview. We traveled in Italian transport ships, zigzagging to avoid British submarines. Some men were seasick, but I found I had good sea legs. The convoy reached Tripoli on December 3, 1941, just days before Pearl Harbor would bring America fully into the war, an event that would ultimately seal Sauer's fate, though he couldn't have known it then. North Africa greeted the new arrivals with a harshness few Europeans were prepared for. The heat was unlike anything I had experienced, Sauer wrote in his memoirs. Not the warm summer days of home, but a scorching, relentless assault that seemed to penetrate your skull. The veterans already stationed there looked different, leaner, darker, with a hardness in their eyes that training couldn't instill. They called the newcomers desert virgins and warned them about scorpions in their boots and the Khamsin winds that could strip the paint off vehicles. Sauer's introduction to desert warfare came quickly. After a brief acclimatization period, his unit was deployed forward to support Rommel's planned offensive against the British Eighth Army. The Desert Fox had been containing British forces in Egypt and was preparing another push to take the Suez Canal. For Sauer, the reality of war arrived not with dramatic tank battles, but with the constant struggle against the environment. Our true enemy was the desert itself, he noted. It destroyed equipment faster than any shell. Sand infiltrated everything, weapons jammed, engines failed, radio equipment required constant maintenance. As a radio operator, Sauer occupied a unique position in the Afrika Korps hierarchy. His technical skills made him valuable, and his role gave him access to a broader picture of operations than the average infantryman. He became part of a tank crew in a Panzer IV, responsible for maintaining communications within the unit and with command. The commander of his tank, Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Müller, was a veteran of the Polish and French campaigns who had volunteered for Africa. Müller taught me how to survive, Sauer would later say. Not just combat, but the desert itself. How to conserve water, how to maintain equipment, how to read the terrain. He treated the tank like a living thing, and in many ways, it was our home. The spring offensive of 1942 saw the Afrika Korps at the height of its prowess. Rommel's forces pushed the British back into Egypt, capturing Tobruk and thousands of Commonwealth troops. Sauer's unit was part of the advance, and for a brief time victory seemed within reach. Those were heady days, he recalled. We truly believed we would reach Alexandria and Cairo. The British were retreating, and morale was high despite the hardships. It was during this period that Sauer earned his Iron Cross Second Class for maintaining radio communications during an artillery barrage, allowing his company to coordinate a counterattack against British armor. Yet the promise of spring gave way to the harsh realities of summer. Supply lines stretched thin across the desert. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and even water became precious commodities. Meanwhile, the British were shortening their own supply lines and receiving reinforcements. The tide began to turn at the First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942, where the British Eighth Army, now under General Claude Auchinleck, halted Rommel's advance just 60 miles from Alexandria. For Sauer, the battle marked a turning point in more ways than one. During an attack on July 2nd, his tank was hit by anti-tank fire. The shell penetrated the turret, killing Müller instantly and severely wounding the gunner. Sauer and the driver managed to evacuate the burning vehicle, but found themselves cut off from their unit. The noise was indescribable, he would later recount. Explosions everywhere, the screech of tracks, the constant radio chatter suddenly gone silent when our equipment was destroyed, and the heat from the sun, from the burning tank, from the fires all around. It felt like the end of the world. The two survivors attempted to reach German lines under cover of darkness, but were captured by British patrol the following morning. Sauer's war in Africa was over after just 7 months. He had entered the theater as part of an advancing, confident force and left it as a prisoner at the moment when Rommel's fortunes began their irreversible decline. The corporal wouldn't know until much later that his capture came just as another momentous shift was occurring in the war. American forces were preparing for Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa that would place Allied forces on both sides of the Axis position. Sauer's first experience as a prisoner of war was in a temporary British holding camp near Alexandria. Here, amid the thousands of captured Germans and Italians, he encountered the first crack in the foundation of German propaganda. The British treated us correctly, he noted with surprise in his diary. We had expected harsh treatment based on what we had been told about enemy brutality. Instead, we received medical care, regular meals, and were treated according to the Geneva Convention. This initial cognitive dissonance, the discovery that the enemy was not as portrayed, would be magnified many times over in the coming years. The British camp was only a temporary arrangement. With their resources stretched thin and concerns about keeping large numbers of prisoners in a still active theater, the British transferred many of their German captives to their allies. In late September 1942, Sauer learned he would be sent to America. The news was received with mixed emotions among the prisoners. Some feared crossing the Atlantic, where German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping. Others saw it as an opportunity to escape the heat and deprivations of North Africa. For Sauer, it represented a journey into the complete unknown. The voyage across the Atlantic took place aboard a converted passenger liner sailing in a protected convoy. Conditions were cramped but not inhumane. We were housed in the hold with hammocks stacked 3 high, Sauer recalled. It was hot and airless, but we were fed regularly, and the American guards were professional. The greatest hardship was psychological, the uncertainty of what awaited them, and the growing realization of how far they were being taken from the war and from home. As the ship approached the American coast in October 1942, the prisoners were allowed on deck in small groups. For many, including Sauer, it was their first glimpse of the United States, the distant skyline of Norfolk, Virginia, appearing on the horizon. It looked unreal, like something from a film, he wrote, so untouched by war, so complete. The contrast with the bombed cities of Europe and the desolation of Africa could not have been more stark. The arrival processing was efficient but disorienting. The prisoners were deloused, given American POW uniforms with PW clearly marked, photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned identification numbers. From Virginia, they traveled by train to Texas, a journey that gave many their first real look at America. Sauer was struck by the vastness of the country and its apparent prosperity, even in wartime. The countryside seemed endless, he noted, farms, towns, factories, all functioning normally. No bomb damage, no signs of rationing or hardship. It made no sense to us then. Where was the impact of war? Sauer's destination was Camp Hearn, one of the larger POW facilities in Texas, designed to hold several thousand men. Located near an agricultural area where labor was in short supply due to American manpower being directed to the war effort, the camp would become home to Sauer and thousands of other German prisoners for the duration of the conflict. Unlike the temporary facilities in North Africa, Camp Hearn was built for long-term detention, with barracks, mess halls, medical facilities, and even recreational areas. The prisoners' first impression of their new home was one of surprise. The camp was clean, organized, and well supplied, Sauer observed. The barracks were simple but solid, with proper beds, blankets, and heating for the winter. The food, while unfamiliar, was plentiful, more than what many of us had received even before capture. This initial shock at the relative comfort of their captivity was common among the Afrika Korps prisoners who had grown accustomed to severe rationing and deprivation on the front lines. Life in Camp Hearn quickly settled into a routine. The Geneva Convention dictated that enlisted POWs could be required to work, but only in non-military capacities and with compensation. The abundant agricultural land surrounding the camp provided an obvious opportunity. Within weeks of arrival, Sauer and many others found themselves working in the cotton fields, replacing the American farm laborers who had either joined the military or moved to higher-paying jobs in war industries. For Sauer, this assignment to agricultural work became the pivotal experience of his captivity. Having grown up in urban Dresden, he had never worked the land before. The cotton fields of Texas, stretching to the horizon, represented an agricultural scale beyond anything he had seen in Germany. "I had no idea how to pick cotton at first," he admitted in later interviews. "My hands were soft, and the sharp bowls cut them until they bled." The heat was familiar after Africa, but the humidity was worse. Still, there was something honest about the work, something real. The Texas farmers who supervised the German prisoners varied in their attitudes. Some were openly hostile, having sons or brothers fighting in Europe. Others were pragmatic, concerned primarily with getting their crops harvested. A few showed unexpected kindness. Sauer recalled one elderly farmer who taught the Germans more efficient picking techniques and occasionally brought extra food from his wife. He had fought in the First War, Sauer explained. He said soldiers were just men following orders, and he didn't hold the war against us as individuals. These direct interactions with Americans, both guards and civilians, provided Sauer with insights that propaganda could never have countered. He observed American farming methods, equipment, and the general standard of living. Even in rural Texas, far from the industrial centers, the material wealth was apparent. Farm machinery that would have been precious in Germany was commonplace here. Vehicles used gasoline lavishly when it was severely rationed in the Reich. Food was abundant when Germans at home were subsisting on ever-decreasing rations. Equally significant was the access to information. While German authorities had controlled all news at home in the American camp, prisoners had access to newspapers, magazines, and radio broadcasts. The camp even had a library and showed movies. The American authorities, confident in their cause, made little attempt to restrict information about the war's progress. Sauer, with his functional English learned during captivity, began to follow the reports of Allied advances in Europe and the Pacific. The turning point for me came in late 1943, Sauer would later write. I was working in a cotton field when the farmer arrived with news of the Allied landing in Italy. He wasn't gloating, just matter-of-factly updating us on what he'd heard on the radio. What struck me wasn't the news itself. We had been expecting Italy to fall, but his casual certainty about the war's outcome. For him, it wasn't a question of if Germany would lose, but when. And standing there, looking at the endless fields, the machinery, the resources, I suddenly knew he was right. This epiphany that Germany's defeat was inevitable didn't come from any particular battle report or propaganda. It came from Sauer's direct observation of American industrial capacity and abundance. The cotton fields of Texas revealed what strategic analyses could not fully convey: the sheer material disparity between the combatants. Germany had launched a war against countries that could outproduce it many times over. One day, I asked the farmer how many tractors were on his farm, Sauer recounted. He owned 5 and considered himself a medium-sized operation. 5 tractors for 1 farm. In my village in Germany, there had been 2 for the entire community, and here they stood idle because fuel was being prioritized for the war effort, yet there was still enough for civilian vehicles. It was then I understood the mathematics of our defeat. The revelation brought Sauer a complex mix of emotions: relief that the war might end sooner rather than later, increasing concern for his family in Dresden under Allied bombing, and a growing sense of having been deceived by his own government about Germany's prospects. These feelings were complicated by the camaraderie he still felt with his fellow prisoners, many of whom remained convinced of eventual German victory. Camp Hearn, like most POW camps in America, contained a mix of political attitudes among the German prisoners. The Afrika Korps men generally maintained higher morale and stronger loyalty to the German cause than those captured later in the war. A corps of committed Nazis attempted to maintain military discipline and ideological purity within the camp. They organized clandestine celebrations of Hitler's birthday, pressured those who seemed too friendly with Americans, and in extreme cases, threatened or attacked prisoners they deemed traitors. Sauer navigated this complex social environment carefully. His private doubts about Germany's prospects remained largely unspoken. He participated in camp activities, worked diligently, and maintained cordial but reserved relationships with the American guards. His technical background and education made him valuable in the camp's internal economy. He repaired radios, helped in the camp canteen, and eventually began teaching basic English to other prisoners. The relative comfort of captivity in Texas stood in stark contrast to what Sauer learned about conditions elsewhere. Letters from home, heavily censored and arriving months late, hinted at increasing hardships. American newspapers carried reports of the bombing of German cities, including Dresden. The prisoners learned about the desperate Battle of Stalingrad, the D-Day landings, and the steady compression of German-held territory from all sides. By early 1944, our conversations in the barracks had changed, Sauer noted. No longer did we debate when Germany would turn the tide, but whether anything would be left of our homes when we returned. Some men still spoke of secret weapons that would reverse everything, but their voices lacked conviction. Most of us had begun the mental process of accepting defeat and wondering what would come after. The cotton harvest of 1944 took place against the backdrop of the Allied push into Germany itself. For Sauer, now in his 3rd year of captivity, the fields of Texas had become more familiar than the streets of Dresden. He had developed calluses on his hands, his skin had darkened under the Texas sun, and he spoke English with increasing fluency, adopting a distinct Texan drawl that amused his fellow prisoners. It was during this period that an incident occurred that would remain with Sauer for the rest of his life. While working in the fields, one of the newer prisoners, a young man captured in France after D-Day, collapsed from heat exhaustion. As Sauer helped him to shade, an American Army doctor was called. The speed and quality of medical response impressed Sauer deeply. The doctor arrived quickly, administered intravenous fluids, and arranged transportation back to camp. Throughout the treatment, the doctor showed the same concern he would have for an American soldier. "I remember asking him why he bothered," Sauer recalled. "Why provide such care for an enemy?" His answer was simple: "Because I'm a doctor, and he's my patient now." That moment contained everything that had begun to change my understanding of America. There was a confidence in that answer, an assurance of certain values that transcended the immediate conflict. As 1944 gave way to 1945, news from Europe grew increasingly dire for Germany. The prisoners learned of the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate offensive in the West, and its failure. Reports of Russian advances from the east became more frequent. In February, news reached Camp Hearn that Dresden had suffered devastating bombing. Sauer, whose family lived in the city center, spent weeks in uncertainty before receiving confirmation that his parents had survived, though their home and his father's bakery were destroyed. When news of Hitler's suicide and Germany's surrender reached the camp in May 1945, the reaction among the prisoners was subdued. There were no celebrations, no dramatic displays of emotion, just a quiet recognition that one chapter had closed and another, still uncertain, was beginning. For many, including Sauer, the most immediate question was, what happens now? The answer was not immediately forthcoming. Despite the war's end in Europe, repatriation of POWs was a complex logistical challenge, complicated by the division of Germany into occupation zones. Additionally, American authorities were in no rush to return labor that had become integral to agricultural production in many regions. Sauer and his fellow prisoners would remain in Texas through another cotton season. The summer of 1945 brought a significant change to Camp Hearn. With the European conflict concluded, the rigid separation between captors and captives began to soften. The American guards, many of whom were preparing for discharge or reassignment to the Pacific Theater, adopted a more relaxed approach. Work details continued, but supervision became less strict. For the first time, Sauer and other prisoners with good behavior records were occasionally permitted to visit local towns under guard, primarily to assist with community projects or special agricultural needs. These limited excursions into American civilian life deepened Sauer's understanding of the country. "The America I saw in 1945 was nothing like what German propaganda had described," he wrote. "We had been told of racial strife, economic depression, and social decay. Instead, I saw a nation already transitioning to peacetime prosperity. Even with rationing still in effect, the stores had goods that had disappeared from German shops years before the war ended." One particular visit to the town of Bryan, Texas, stood out in Sauer's memory. His detail was assigned to help unload supplies at a warehouse. During their lunch break, the prisoners sat in a cordoned-off section of a local diner. Sauer observed American families eating ice cream, children playing without apparent concern, and general normality that seemed surreal after years of war. "A small boy came up to our table," he recalled. Instead of fear or hatred, he showed only curiosity. He asked if we were really Germans and whether we had seen Hitler. His mother quickly pulled him away, apologizing to us, for the intrusion. The humanity of that moment was overwhelming. Within the camp itself, educational opportunities expanded significantly. The American authorities, with remarkable foresight, began preparing the prisoners for eventual return to a democratic Germany. Courses were offered in American history, democratic principles, and practical subjects like automotive mechanics and construction. Sauer, with his technical background and growing English proficiency, found himself serving as an interpreter and sometimes assistant instructor in these programs. "I took every class available," he later said, "partly to occupy my mind, but increasingly because I was thinking about the future." Germany was destroyed. Whatever came next would require new skills and new understanding. This pragmatic approach characterized Sauer throughout his captivity. While some prisoners retreated into nostalgia or bitterness, he looked forward, gathering knowledge and observations that might serve him in the post-war world. The most significant development of this period was the establishment of a formal re-education program for German POWs. Initiated by the U.S. War Department, this program aimed to expose prisoners to democratic values and counter years of Nazi indoctrination. Special camp newspapers were published, films about American institutions were shown, and discussion groups were organized. Unlike Soviet re-education programs, which were often coercive, the American approach relied on voluntary participation and intellectual persuasion. Sauer's reaction to these efforts was complex. I wasn't naive, he reflected. I recognized it as propaganda, but of a different sort than what we had experienced in Germany. The Americans didn't demand conversion or confession. They presented their system and allowed us to draw our own conclusions. This respect for individual judgment, even among enemies, made a stronger case for democracy than any lecture could. Not all prisoners were as receptive. The die-hard Nazis in camp viewed the program with hostility, labeling participants as traitors. Those who attended lectures or read the special newspapers sometimes found their belongings vandalized or received threats. On one occasion, a violent confrontation erupted when a group of hardliners attempted to disrupt a screening of a documentary about concentration camps. The incident resulted in several prisoners being transferred to more secure facilities. For Sauer, the material about Nazi atrocities proved particularly challenging. Like many Germans, he had been unaware of the full extent of the regime's crimes. The initial reaction was disbelief, accusations of American propaganda. But as evidence accumulated through multiple sources, including German witnesses and documentation, denial became untenable. Accepting this truth was perhaps the most difficult part of captivity, he admitted. Not the physical hardships or separation from home, but reconciling what Germany had become with the country I thought I was serving. By late 1945, the question of repatriation became more pressing. The first groups of prisoners, primarily those from regions under American occupation, began departing for Germany. Others, especially those from areas under Soviet control, expressed concerns about returning. Sauer, whose home in Dresden was now in the Soviet zone, faced a difficult decision. Reports from returning prisoners painted a grim picture of conditions in post-war Germany: food shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and harsh Soviet administration. During this period of uncertainty, Sauer formed an unexpected friendship that would influence his future decisions. Dr. Thomas Miller, a professor of engineering from nearby Texas A&M University, occasionally visited the camp to deliver technical lectures. Recognizing Sauer's aptitude and interest, Miller began bringing additional books and spending time discussing engineering concepts with the young German. Dr. Miller treated me as a student, not a prisoner, Sauer recalled. He would bring problems for me to solve, review my work, and assign new material. It was the first time since capture that someone had engaged with me purely on an intellectual level, seeing potential rather than an enemy. This mentorship provided not just knowledge, but a vision of possible futures that Sauer had not previously considered. The winter of 1945-46 brought news that repatriation schedules were accelerating. With labor needs decreasing and maintenance costs for the POW program mounting, American authorities were eager to conclude the operation. For prisoners like Sauer, the prospect of return evoked mixed emotions. Germany, or what remained of it, had become almost abstract, a place remembered rather than known. By then, I had spent longer in Texas than I had in the Afrika Korps, he noted. I spoke English daily, understood American customs, and had adapted to life here. Germany was home, but a home that reports described as unrecognizable. The letters from my parents spoke of hunger, cold, and uncertainty, under Soviet administration. In early 1946, Sauer made a decision that would alter the course of his life. Encouraged by Dr. Miller, he applied for a special program allowing a limited number of German POWs to remain temporarily in the United States for educational purposes. The program was highly selective, requiring sponsorship from an American citizen, demonstrated academic potential, and security clearance. Miller offered to sponsor Sauer for engineering studies at Texas A&M. The application process was lengthy and uncertain. Many factors worked against Sauer. The general policy favored rapid repatriation. Public sentiment was not universally welcoming to Germans remaining, and preference was given to prisoners with specialized knowledge in fields of immediate value. However, Miller's reputation and Sauer's excellent record in captivity worked in his favor. While awaiting a decision, Sauer continued working in the increasingly emptying camp. The cotton season of 1946 saw a fraction of the previous year's prisoner workforce. Many fields returned to using civilian labor as Americans discharged from military service sought employment. The atmosphere in Camp Hearn grew more relaxed as the population decreased and security concerns diminished. Remaining prisoners were consolidated with greater privileges and reduced restrictions. In June 1946, Sauer received the news his application had been approved. He would be allowed to stay for 2 years to study engineering under Dr. Miller's supervision, with the understanding that he would return to Germany afterward to assist in reconstruction. The decision arrived just weeks before he was scheduled for repatriation to the Soviet zone. I felt both relief and guilt, he later confessed. Relief at avoiding the uncertainties of Soviet occupation, but guilt at postponing reunion with my family. I wrote to my parents explaining my decision, hoping they would understand it wasn't abandonment but preparation to help them more effectively later. Sauer's transition from prisoner to student was abrupt but manageable. In July 1946, he was formally released from POW status, though still classified as an enemy alien, with certain restrictions on travel and employment. He moved into a small apartment near the Texas A&M campus in College Station, supported by a modest stipend from his work as a laboratory assistant for Dr. Miller. The university environment presented new challenges. Though most faculty welcomed him professionally, student reactions varied. Many were recent veterans of the European theater, some with direct combat experience against the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe. There were uncomfortable moments, Sauer acknowledged. Silence when I entered rooms, occasional hostile comments, but also curiosity and increasingly acceptance. The shared focus on technical problems created a common ground that sometimes transcended the recent past. Sauer's academic performance quickly distinguished him. His technical aptitude, disciplined study habits formed during captivity, and determination to make the most of this opportunity resulted in excellent grades. By his second semester, he had earned sufficient trust to assist in teaching laboratory sections, working primarily with freshmen who had no military service. Throughout this period, Sauer maintained correspondence with his parents in Dresden and with former fellow prisoners who had returned to both West and East Germany. These letters provided a window into the diverging realities of post-war German reconstruction. Those in American, British, and French zones described improving conditions, increasing freedoms, and the beginnings of economic recovery. Reports from the Soviet zone told of continuing hardships, political repression, and the dismantling of industrial infrastructure for reparations. The contrast in these accounts confirmed I had made the right decision, Sauer reflected. By remaining in America to study, I was gaining knowledge that would be valuable in either German state, while avoiding the worst period of deprivation. Yet I never lost sight of my obligation to return and contribute to rebuilding. As his 2-year permission to remain approached its conclusion in mid-1948, international tensions were rising. The Berlin blockade had begun, marking the escalation of Cold War hostilities. The division of Germany was solidifying from temporary occupation into permanent separation. For Sauer, these developments complicated his planned return. In a pivotal meeting with immigration officials, Sauer learned that the deteriorating relations with the Soviet Union meant the U.S. government was reluctant to send someone with his technical training to the Eastern Zone. Given his residence in Dresden, he would have to return to what was now becoming the German Democratic Republic unless he could secure sponsorship for a more permanent status in the West. Once again, Dr. Miller intervened. Having observed Sauer's contributions to his department over 2 years, Miller arranged a meeting with representatives from a growing engineering firm in Houston with military contracts. The company was seeking technically skilled employees who could work on specialized communications equipment, precisely the field where Sauer's military radio experience and subsequent education had prepared him. The timing proved fortunate. The acute post-war labor shortage, combined with increasing recognition of the value of German technical expertise, had led to the passage of specialized visa programs. The company offered to sponsor Sauer for a work visa, with potential for permanent residency. The decision required committing to a longer separation from his family, but offered the possibility of eventually bringing them to America if conditions permitted. After considerable soul-searching and exchanges of letters with his parents, Sauer accepted the position in Houston. "My father's last letter decided me," he explained. He wrote that Dresden was changing in ways that would have broken his heart if he weren't so focused on daily survival. "Build a life where opportunity exists," he told me. "Perhaps someday we can join you there." Sauer's transition to civilian employment marked yet another adaptation. Houston in the late 1940s was booming, with the energy industry fueling rapid growth. His technical skills were in high demand, and his status as a former enemy became increasingly irrelevant as the focus shifted to the new Cold War tensions. Within the technical community, his background was often viewed as an asset rather than a liability. German engineering training carried considerable respect. The early 1950s brought both professional success and personal developments. Sauer's position at the engineering firm advanced steadily. His alien status was adjusted to permanent residency, and he met Catherine Schultz, a second-generation German-American teacher. Their marriage in 1952 further rooted him in American society, yet Germany remained present in his thoughts, particularly as news of the growing repression in East Germany reached the West. The 1953 workers' uprising in East Germany was a turning point, Sauer noted. "When Soviet tanks crushed the protests, I finally accepted that the Dresden I had known was gone for the foreseeable future. My parents were aging, living under a regime that viewed Western contact with suspicion. The letters became more guarded, less frequent, and eventually stopped entirely in 1954. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, Sauer built a successful career and family life in Texas. He became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1958, raised 3 children, and eventually started his own communications equipment company. The former prisoner of war had transformed into an American small business owner, employing dozens of people, including several refugees from Eastern Europe. It wasn't until 1972, following the initial thaw in East-West relations, that Sauer was able to return to Dresden for the first time since 1941. The visit was bittersweet. His parents had passed away years earlier. The city had been rebuilt along Soviet architectural lines, and his childhood neighborhood was barely recognizable. Yet some connections remained, including cousins and a few childhood friends who had survived both the bombing and the post-war years. Standing in Dresden's Altmarkt after 30 years away, I was struck by parallel realities, he wrote afterward. In one life, I might have returned from Africa to this. Reconstruction under socialism, limited horizons, the weight of the wall. In the actual path, a Texas cotton field had redirected everything. Both Germany and I had been divided by history, developing along divergent lines that could never fully reconnect. In later years, Sauer became increasingly willing to share his experiences. After initial reluctance to discuss the war, He began speaking to historical societies, university classes, and eventually participating in formal oral history projects. His perspective as someone who had experienced both the Afrika Korps and American captivity provided valuable insights into a chapter of World War II history that received less attention than the European or Pacific theaters. Particularly notable was his 1978 interview with the Texas Historical Commission, where he first articulated what became his most quoted observation: "If there's ever another war, pray to be fighting against Americans. Then surrender to them. You'll be better off than many civilians on the winning side." This statement captured the essence of Sauer's unique experience, the recognition that the material abundance and institutional values he encountered in captivity had fundamentally changed his understanding of both the war and his place in the world. The cotton fields of Texas had revealed America's industrial might more effectively than any military intelligence report could have done. The opening of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and subsequent German reunification brought a final chapter to Sauer's story. In 1991, 50 years after his deployment to North Africa, he returned to a unified Germany with his American family. His children and grandchildren, raised on stories of a divided homeland, could now see a Germany reshaping itself once again. For Sauer, then in his 70s, the journey represented a closing of historical circles, from the confident young corporal shipping out to join Rommel, to the prisoner in Texas, to the successful American businessman, and finally to an elder witnessing his birth nation's rebirth. During this visit, Sauer participated in a gathering of former Afrika Korps veterans in Munich, where he reconnected with others who had shared the Desert Campaign. Among them were several who had also been held in American POW camps. Their discussions revealed common threads: the initial shock at American abundance, the gradual shift in perspective during captivity, and the various paths their lives had taken afterward. "What struck me most," Sauer observed, "was how those experiences in America had influenced all of us, regardless of our subsequent choices. Some returned to Germany immediately and helped rebuild. Others, like me, had stayed and built new lives. But we all carried the same revelation, that what we had seen in America had changed our understanding of the war and of Germany's place in the world." The reunion brought into focus how the POW experience had created a unique cohort within the generation of German war veterans. Unlike those who had fought until surrender or been captured on the Eastern Front, the Afrika Korps prisoners in America had experienced a transition that was both physical and psychological, from the certainties of the Third Reich to the complexity of American society, and then to the divided post-war world. This perspective had often placed them in the vanguard of West Germany's reconstruction and reconciliation efforts. "We became unofficial interpreters between cultures," one former POW, now a Bavarian businessman, explained. "We understood both sides in ways others couldn't. We had seen America not as tourists or diplomats, but from the inside, working its fields, observing its families, learning its contradictions and strengths firsthand." Sauer's personal story took a poignant turn during the 1991 visit. Through the efforts of local historians in Dresden, he was able to access records that revealed more about his parents' final years. His father had reopened a small bakery in 1948 but struggled under East German economic policies. His mother had worked as a seamstress until her health failed in the late 1950s. They had made repeated applications to travel to the West to see their son, all denied. Their last letter, never delivered, had been held in Stasi files, a simple expression of pride in his achievements and hope for eventual reunion. Reading their words after all those years was both painful and healing, Sauer reflected. The system that kept us apart is now gone, but too late for us to reunite in life. Yet there was comfort in knowing they had understood my choice and supported it, even at great personal cost. The fall of the Berlin Wall also allowed Sauer to reconnect with his hometown in meaningful ways. In 1993, he established a small scholarship fund at the Technical University of Dresden for engineering students. The Wilhelm and Margarete Sauer Memorial Scholarship, named for his parents, specifically supported projects related to communication technology, linking his Afrika Korps role as a radio operator, his subsequent education in Texas, and his professional career. In 1995, Sauer published his memoirs, From Rommel to Texas, An Afrika Korps Journey. The book gained attention not just as a war narrative, but as a unique perspective on German-American relations during a transformative historical period. Reviewers noted its nuanced treatment of complex loyalties and its insight into how individual lives intersect with sweeping historical forces. The German edition, published the following year, became particularly popular among younger Germans seeking to understand their grandparents' generation. Sauer's story gained wider attention in 1998 when he was featured in a documentary about German POWs in America. The filmmakers recorded him revisiting Camp Hearn, by then largely reclaimed by Texas scrubland, with only foundation outlines remaining. Standing in what had once been the camp's cotton fields, Sauer reflected on the experience that had changed his life's trajectory. It was here, under this sky, that I first understood what Germany was truly facing, he told the camera. Not just military defeat, but a confrontation with a society that could produce seemingly limitless resources while maintaining the values it claimed to represent. The cotton taught me more than any battle could have done. The documentary brought renewed scholarly attention to the POW camp system, which had remained a relatively understudied aspect of America's home front during World War II. Historians noted that the program had been remarkably successful both as a solution to wartime labor shortages and as an exercise in cultural diplomacy. The more than 400,000 German POWs who returned to Europe carried first-hand experience of American society during a crucial period of 20th century realignment. For Camp Hearn specifically, the attention sparked local preservation efforts. A small museum was established, and the site was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Sauer contributed oral histories, photographs, and artifacts from his time there. His technical drawings of the camp layout, meticulously preserved since 1945, proved particularly valuable to archaeologists documenting the site. As Sauer entered his 80s, he increasingly reflected on the unexpected turns his life had taken. When I boarded that transport ship to Africa in 1941, I was a true believer, he noted in a 2001 interview. Germany seemed invincible, the war just, and my future predetermined. The journey from that certainty to understanding how completely wrong those assumptions were, that was the real distance I traveled, far greater than the miles from Dresden to Texas. This journey from certainty to complexity characterized not just Sauer's personal evolution, but Germany's national reckoning with its past. Like his adopted country, Sauer had moved from the black-and-white certainties of wartime to a more nuanced understanding of history and responsibility. His dual perspective as both German and American gave him unique insights into how nations construct and reconstruct their identities around historical memory. In his final years, Sauer devoted considerable energy to educational outreach, particularly to young people. He regularly spoke at schools, emphasizing not military adventures, but the human consequences of ideological certainty and the importance of critical thinking. Question what you're told about enemies, he would advise students. The people I was ordered to fight against became my teachers, my colleagues, my friends, and eventually my fellow citizens. That possibility exists in every conflict if we remain open to seeing the humanity on both sides. Wilhelm Sauer passed away in 2006 at his home in Houston at the age of 87. His funeral reflected the dual nature of his life's journey, a Lutheran service with both German and American flags displayed, attended by family, fellow engineers, and several aging veterans from both sides of the former conflict. His grandson read a passage from his memoirs that summarized his philosophy. History placed me in uniform and sent me to war, but individual Americans in a Texas cotton field taught me peace. Both experiences shaped me, and I have tried to honor the lessons of each. The story of Corporal Wilhelm Sauer, from the desert battles of North Africa to the cotton fields of Texas and beyond, encapsulates a uniquely personal window into the larger currents of 20th century history. His journey paralleled Germany's own transition from militarism to defeat, division, and eventual reunification. Through his eyes, we see how grand historical forces manifest in individual lives, and how seemingly small moments, like the revelation that came while picking cotton, can fundamentally alter one's understanding of the world. The cotton fields of Texas might seem an unlikely classroom for learning about global power dynamics, but for Sauer and thousands of other German POWs, they provided an education no military briefing could match. The sheer abundance of American agriculture, the mechanization, the efficient logistics, all revealed the material foundations of Allied victory more clearly than any battle could have done. As Sauer put it in his final interview, in Africa, we could believe victory was still possible. In Texas, picking cotton, I could see with my own eyes why it never had been. This insight, that Germany's defeat was inevitable, not primarily because of military tactics or battlefield courage, but because of vast industrial disparities, was one that many German POWs in America reached independently. Their letters, diaries, and memoirs record similar moments of revelation while harvesting crops, working in canneries, or building roads. The direct experience of American productive capacity made abstract economic theories concrete and undeniable. Yet Sauer's story is more than a lesson in industrial economics. It illustrates how human connections formed even across enemy lines. The Texas farmer who taught picking techniques, Dr. Miller who saw potential rather than threat, the Army doctor who treated all patients equally, these individual Americans complicated the enemy image Sauer had been given. Similarly, his presence in Texas communities humanized the abstract German threat for locals who had only encountered the enemy through war bond posters and newsreels. The legacy of this cultural exchange worked in both directions. German POWs introduced their American hosts to different foods, music, and customs. Many Americans who interacted with the prisoners noted their discipline, technical skills, and work ethic. These interactions, multiplied across hundreds of camps throughout the country, created a generation of Germans with personal connections to America and Americans with more nuanced views of Germans than wartime propaganda had allowed. In the post-war rebuilding of West Germany, these returning prisoners often became important bridges between cultures. Their familiarity with American practices and values helped facilitate the economic and political partnerships that developed during the Cold War. Similarly, in the American occupation zone, administrators who had managed POW camps brought insights about German society that helped shape more effective policies. For Sauer personally, the cotton fields represented the beginning of a lifelong process of reconciling dual identities. He remained proudly German in many aspects of his heritage and memory, while becoming thoroughly American in his civic participation and future orientation. This balancing act, honoring where he had come from while embracing where life had taken him, required constant negotiation but ultimately produced a richer perspective than either identity alone could have provided. In 2018, 12 years after Sauer's death, his story gained renewed attention when Camp Hearn hosted a reunion of families connected to both former prisoners and guards. Among the attendees was Sauer's youngest granddaughter, now a graduate student researching German-American relations. She brought copies of his wartime journals, which the family had recently donated to the camp's historical collection. My grandfather always said that understanding comes through specific human stories, not abstract categories, she told the gathering. He wasn't just a German or a prisoner, or later an American. He was Wilhelm, with particular experiences that shaped his unique journey. And the people he encountered weren't just Americans or enemies or guards. They were individuals who sometimes showed cruelty, but more often kindness. This perspective, seeing beyond categories to individual humanity, remains perhaps the most valuable lesson from Sauer's remarkable journey. In an era again marked by hardening ideological divisions and dehumanization of perceived enemies, his story reminds us that understanding often arrives in unexpected places and forms. Sometimes, as for a young Dresden baker turned Afrika Korps radio operator, it comes while picking cotton under the vast Texas sky, where the impossible abundance of America revealed a truth about the world that no propaganda could conceal.